thank you very much for inviting me. It's always nice to see young people who are interested in those matters, rather than some other matters that young people may be interested in. But anyway, Latoya has made my day. She just said that nasty bit of work who perpetrated a massacre in Norway actually quotes from my books. And that, as I say, it made my day. At least somebody does. He quotes from a lot of people, I mean, actually. Anyway, the latest review of my book just came out in a rather left-leaning publication. And it was sort of a laudatory review, so I wondered what I'd done wrong. But then they called me a grumpy old man and a member of the clubbable right. So I realized that I must have done something right. And I took exception to old grumpy, I don't mind, because I'm vain enough to think that I'm sort of late middle age. And I also took exception to clubbable, because I can't think of a single self-respecting club that would have me as a member. But anyway, the author of that review is the economics editor of the BBC. So I'm truly amazed that he found anything good to say about the book at all. But economists in general are kind of a very interesting breed these days. Recently, a little boy asked his mother, "Mommy, who was Adam Smith?" And she said he was an economist. And the boy says, "Well, just like Daddy." He said, "Oh no," he said, "Daddy's a senior economist." And the difference between real economists and today's senior economists employed by banks and governments is that the former use their common sense to describe the way people made a living, while the latter use equations and curves and economic models to create a virtual world divorced from reality and thus serving only its own denizens, not the rest of us. Thus, to quote from Smith, what is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. The virtual economist, Samuel Britton, the Financial Times economics guru, disagrees. He says, "Since my undergraduate days, I have been pointing out that the government budget is not the same as that of the individual." He's right about that. It's not these days. That's precisely the problem. Before making his pronouncements, Sir Samuel would have been well advised to reread his David Copperfield, where Mr. Micawber gets it just right. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £19.19 and 6. Result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 ought and 6. Result, misery. So why did Dickens, untrained in the recondite wisdom of the economic science, and understand what the modern economists really do not? What is it about economics, of the economy, that makes it too simple for modern economists to understand? The answer is Smith and Dickens lived in the real world, and modern economists in the virtual one, divorced from reality. That's why so few of them predicted the Great Depression of the 1930s, or indeed the current crisis. And as late as 1989, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, the Nobel laureate Paul Samuelson confidently predicted that within a couple of years the Soviet economy would lead the world. And then the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, exactly 2 years later. So what modern economists seem to ignore is that economics is an aspect of human behavior. And people's behavior is determined by what they think, what they regard as right or wrong, or else stupid or clever. And that is a reflection of what they believe, as it were, of the metaphysical premise from which they proceed. Of these, of metaphysical premises, there are many, but in the West, they can be broadly reduced to two. The first is Judeo-Christian. We're created by God, and the purpose of our life is to reunite with God in His kingdom. Thus, everything that's conducive to achieving that purpose is good and clever. Everything that's not is bad and stupid. If we proceed from this metaphysical premise, money can still be important, but it will never be all important, especially if acquiring it is in conflict with the higher purpose. The second metaphysical premise is materialist. A living cell appeared on Earth as a result of some biochemical accident, eventually evolving into animals capable of creating Charter Cathedral and the B minor Mass. We live out 70 and turn into fertilizer. Given that, it's the process of life that becomes its purpose. We must derive maximum pleasure out of every short moment on Earth, and most pleasures cost money. Thus, pursuing material self-interest in general, and money in particular, becomes the main quest of life. In fact, the American Declaration of Independence specifies pursuit of happiness, by which they meant money, as one of the quintessential rights, above practically everything else. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was kind of the Catholics' meaning by it. It's critical to realize that our civilization was created and made as great as it is by those who proceeded from the first metaphysical premise, and it was then taken all over and practically destroyed by those worshipping at the altar of the second. The process was gradual, and in my book I trace it through the key phases: the Renaissance humanism, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and post-Enlightenment modernity, showing how the dominant philosophical and religious ideas of each phase affected economic behavior in each phase. And if you doubt that religion has anything to do with economics, consider the fact that even in our agnostic time, Protestant countries enjoy a per capita GDP that's 1.5 times greater than in Catholic countries, 3 times greater than in Orthodox ones, and 5 times greater than in Muslim ones. This despite the ocean of petrodollars sloshing underfoot in the greatest Orthodox country and quite a few Muslim ones. As man was shifted from the periphery of God's world to the center of his own, Western people were sold a lie, that the sum total of millions of private interests will add up to public virtue both in politics, through the expedient of voting, and in economics, through free markets. Actually, some libertarians, I know, obviously not present here, perpetuate the same myth. You can shoot me to pieces afterwards. And as a result, we in the West abandoned God because he was no longer needed. Unless experience has shown that stripped of any responsibility to the absolute and moral authority, democracy becomes spivocracy, the rule by corrupt non-entities, while free markets are reduced to a giant pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme, practiced either legally by governments and banks or illegally by the likes of Bernie Madoff. The process entered its final phase more than 100 years ago, when Max Weber, and I'm sure those of you who are in the humanities know that, in his canonical book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, felt justified to say that, quote, man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of life. To any past thinker, this statement would have sounded not just wrong, but downright mad. But Weber was merely stating the obvious. The actual reality of Christendom is preserved by the virtual kind, producing creatures animated entirely by material self-interest. There was no longer any spiritual adhesive holding society together. the world was suffering from a degenerative metaphysical disease, of which the current financial crisis is but one of the symptoms. Since then, we've seen that when the economy becomes the be-all and end-all, it comes with an awful price tag. What is at fault in modern economics is not that some of it is libertarian and some of that is not, but that all of it comes from a strictly materialist view of the world. Like Orwell's animals, both socialists and economic libertarians reduce everything to a single issue. They just can't agree on the number of legs. It was Aristotle who wrote that the society that pursues wealth rather than virtue will end up using this wealth against itself. This is exactly what's happening now, with politicians, bankers, and the public all driven by the second metaphysical premise, which is materialist, destroying the very economy at the altar of which they worship. Let's look at the three culprits one by one. Just like economics, modern politics serves its practitioners, not the public. Great self-perpetuating power is the only purpose of today's politicians. There are, of course, exceptions, but these are usually marginalized and eventually ousted. To that end, they strive to distance themselves from the very demos in whose name they supposedly govern, centralizing power within the confines of their own like-minded elite. Thus, they destroy the last vestiges of accountability and can pursue what really matters to them, self-interest and bono publico, be damned. This explains, for example, the unstoppable march of the European Union. There is not a single rational argument in favor of this abomination that cannot be destroyed in 5 minutes flat by an averagely educated person. But looking at it from our perspective, we see how the EU serves the ultimate purpose of our politicians by both eliminating their accountability and providing a nice little earner for them once they've finished their national political careers. Look at the Kinnocks. The Kinnocks, by some estimates, have made something like £70 million, courtesy of Brussels. So how do they increase their power in what is still believed to be the free world? The main levers they have to rely on, not being able to rely on coercion, are economic, specifically the totalitarian economism that is the defining feature of the modern West. To start with, modern governments create a vast underclass by spending astronomical sums on the economically ruinous and morally corrupting welfare state. Its denizens become an important factor of the political elite's self-perpetuation. And not just its denizens, for such incontinent spending requires extortionate taxation, with the state looting at least half of what people earn, and no one really objecting. We've been brainwashed to worship statism. Such spending is also hugely inflationary, of course. By taxing and devaluing people's money, the state makes them devote every waking moment to making more. People become slaves to money, and the real value of what they earn depends on the government's largesse. For example, Gordon Brown, when he was still Chancellor, was very proud, and he said very proudly, that we let you keep a lot more of your money than the previous government. You can let somebody keep something that legitimately belongs to you, not to them. So the assumption is that our money is not really our money. And every day provides a vindication of Burke's belief that the moment the government appears at market, the principles of the market will become subverted. Governments began to appear at market in modern times. That's why runaway inflation is a distinctly modern phenomenon. Just look at the last 50 years of the 19th century, from 1850 to 1900. Now, £100 in the 1850 became £110 in 1900, a negligible inflation of 10% over 50 years. By contrast, £100 in 1950 became £2,000 in the year 2000. a soul-destroying, economy-busting inflation of 2,000%. Add to this the steadily growing taxes, and state control over property becomes absolute. Our money isn't really ours. Its value is controlled by the political elite with a vested interest in an orgy of inflationary and corrupting spending. As a result of this, the word trillion has become common parlance. I don't know if you've noticed that, because even 10 years ago, people talked in terms of billions when they wanted to talk about huge amounts of money. The US national debt, for example, is $14 trillion and rising. Ours is £1 trillion and rising. US credit card debt is over $1 trillion and rising. China and Russia, between them, hold the best part of $2 trillion. Now we're told that it will take at least 2 trillion euros to save the euro. Well, I dare say if it takes $2 trillion to save it, it's not worth saving, but that's only me. And that's on top of the trillion spent already. So a trillion here, a trillion there, before long we'll start talking serious money. Now the second culprit is the so-called financial services that some people believe ought to be self-regulating. In theory, so they should be. But since our financial people are also driven by the second metaphysical premise, they are manifestly incapable of self-control. On the contrary, they can bankrupt both their companies and the whole economy as long as their own nest is nicely feathered. Between 2007 and 2009, the market value of the West banks collapsed. RBS went from 120 to 4.6 billion. For example, UBS from 116 to 35, Citicorp from 255 to 19, and so forth. No wonder, just as politicians serve themselves only, not the public, banks and other corporations serve their managers, not their owners, not the shareholders. One example. Not so long ago, every London paper carried the story of a young female executive working at a hedge fund whose louche manager had treated her inappropriately. Now, we're all sympathetic to the young lady's actionable plight, but it's hard not to notice that her starting salary immediately out of university was £60,000 a year. In the next 5 years, while she was still in her mid-20s, her annual salary rose to £577,000 a year, and that's not even taking account bonuses. In 1 year, she got £1.4 million. This was happening at the height of the crisis, when the people supposedly being served by the girl's hedge fund were probably losing money right, left, and center. Yet while the papers were full of indignation at her plight, few commented on this outrageous skimming of other people's money. The same metaphysical folly run riot led to the crisis in mortgage lending that was the immediate cause of the 2008 crisis. After which, by the way, I wrote an article saying we haven't seen anything yet. Things are going to get much worse. And at that time, not many people, but one shouldn't say I told you so. It's really a bad thing. But anyway, the irresponsible lending, the likes of which had never been seen in the West, had a perverse logic behind it. Bankers knew that with the interest rates kept artificially low and all eligibility requirements for loans waived, many personal loans would never be repaid. But defaults will happen in the future while their bonuses are today, and that's all that matters. Thus, some banks accumulated bad and potentially suicidal debts worth 100 times their total capital. 100 times. By way of self-protection, they issued derivative bonds on the bad loans and sell them on to one another with a large surcharge until the combined value of the debts on some mortgages reached 15 times their original value. The banks also kept protecting themselves with clever mechanisms such as the credit default swap until everyone was insured, which means no one was insured. when the penny drops, the piper needs to be paid, to mix the metaphors ever so slightly. And at present, the combined value of outstanding derivatives in the world equals 10 times the GDP of the entire world combined. And this delayed action bomb is yet to go off. Compared to that explosion, the present crisis will seem like a firecracker. Meanwhile, the states stepped in to nationalize the banks, and this suited the inner imperative of both parties. The bankers were thereby further removed from accountability to their shareholders and depositors, and the politicians acquired even more power. Job done. Within weeks of the catastrophe, £1 million bonuses were back. Politicians and bankers once again joined one another in the virtual world. The stock market also resides at that address. In the real world, the value of a company's shares directly reflected its performance. Companies that did well paid high dividends. Those doing less well paid less. People bought shares for the long haul, relying on the dividends for their income pretty much the way people used to rely on interest on their bank deposits for their income. Length of ownership was measured in years. Now people buy shares not for the dividends, but for a quick killing on their value. Thus, length of ownership got to be measured in months, then weeks, then days, then hours, and now, with the advent of high-frequency trading, HFT, it's called, in seconds. Thus, the whole thing is reduced to frantic gambling, driven by the roulette mentality of getting something for nothing. And last year in the US, 75% of all trading in securities was high frequency. High-frequency traders use powerful computers to track markets in real time, taking advantage of positions open for seconds only. As a result, they often dispose of their entire portfolios in a single day, with share prices fluctuating widely and with absolutely no reference to the underlying performance of the companies. That makes asset stripping, by the way, such a widespread pastime. The share value of some companies often drops below the value of their hard assets, and even sometimes below the amount of cash they have in the bank. So spot a disparity like that, move in, buy the company, take its cash, flog off its assets, then close it down, with the newly unemployed workers wondering what would hit a seemingly successful concern. Our third culprit is the public, which is us. We too worship at the altar of the second metaphysical premise. We too define our worth on the basis of practical success in the virtual world. We too are driven by the hysterical desire to make it, and preferably at an early age. In the real world, people knew they had to work for their money, but for us this takes too long. We want it all now, for tomorrow we may be dead. We want to consume, and we want to be seen to consume, for our self-respect demands it. Thus, what Thorsten Veblen called conspicuous consumption became the defining feature of modern society. Alas, we're finding out that when consumption reigns supreme, the whole society becomes consumptive. Our incontinent spending and borrowing are encouraged by the governments and banks, for that way we become cogs in the machine of totalitarian economism. As we know that the value of money constantly goes down, we either spend it with no regard for tomorrow, or take insane risks, trying to put it into something that's unlikely to disappear altogether, mostly property. Thus, the property business in the UK has become bigger than manufacturing in total turnover, with the concomitant inflation of assets. Over the last 50 years, property inflation has outstripped money inflation by a factor of 7. The underlying assumption is that we can all become rich by selling our houses to one another, which is a circular argument if I've ever heard one. Yet while we invest and spend huge amounts, the real income in the US and the rest of the West has been stagnant for 20 years. That means that personal indebtedness has replaced personal income. True enough, in the US over the last 2 decades, average family expenditure has been 3 times higher than the average family incomes. So people have, on average, spent 3 times more than they earned over 20 years. And credit card debts alone have gone over $1 trillion, and they're still going up. All this proceeds to the accompaniment of the economists bleating about the virtue of a service economy. Let the poor countries make things. We're too clever for that. Again, in the real world, this idea would be tenable. But in our virtual world, financial services have been largely reduced to shuffling around worthless paper, pretending that this would benefit some people other than the shufflers. Both financial services and public services have indeed become self-services. And we, the public, driven by the same metaphysical folly, are willing to accept make-believe as real. So there we have it, our virtual world with neither governments, nor banks, nor the public paying their way. But a society that lives on borrowed money, lives on borrowed time. Our governments treat the problem by the same iatrogenic medicine that largely created it in the first place. We've printed more money in the last 3 years than in the previous century, which is coyly called quantitative easing, presumably queasing for short. A few days ago, the Bank of England printed another £75 billion, promising more in the near future. But quantitative easing spells qualitative disaster by being hugely inflationary and encouraging exactly the kind of behavior that was responsible for the crisis in the first place, borrowing rather than saving. Queasing is accompanied by largely mythical cuts, which will, at best, slow down the growth of public spending, not reduce it. The measures our government are taking only appear to be hard-boiled. In fact, they're half-baked. At best, they'll paper over the cracks until the next election, when all the bombs sticking under our economies are likely to go off. To conclude, by shifting from the first to the second metaphysical premise, we have replaced freedom with liberty, wisdom with cleverness, sentiment with sentimentality, justice with legalism, quality of life with standard of living, art with pickled animals, music with incoherent noise, statecraft with politicking, love with sex, communication with sound bites, self-confidence with effrontery, equality before God with leveling, respect for others with political correctness. In short, everything real with virtual caricatures. So we now live in the virtual world, and it's not at all surprising that we're living on virtual money. That's me done. Thank you. And now let the sniping begin.
Does anybody have any questions? Cal?
Is there something that you're optimistic about?
Well, I am, according to my reviewer, a grumpy old man. Well, I'm certainly not optimistic about our economic prospects, let's put it this way. I'm certainly not optimistic about our cultural and social prospects. But I do think that we've been put on this earth for a purpose, and we must achieve this purpose in the end. I think that for things to improve dramatically in the West, we'll need a major catastrophe, either economic or perhaps military. And I think that's going to happen, because if you look, for example, at the Great Depression of the 30s, when the West was really essentially bankrupt, it took a world war to pull us out. I'm not saying that it's going to happen. In fact, I'm praying that it won't happen. But I really don't see any avenues open to the West for drastic improvement in the absence of a major catastrophe. More likely the catastrophe will be economic, actually, because another year or two of this, and the whole economy can go their complete meltdown, and when people make optimistic noises. For example, in today's Times, Anatol Kaletsky, who is the main economic guru, says how wonderful we have more quantitative easing. We're injecting more money in the economy, and the economy will bounce back. Now, Anatol Kaletsky is the most reliable sage in the economy, because you can be absolutely certain that everything he predicts will happen in the exact reverse. So when he says that things will improve in the next 2 years, I mean, run for the fields. Well, you see, I'm not by nature a pessimist. I am, however, by nature a realist. I just try to look at facts as they are and comment on them.
Do you have follow-up questions there? Oh, we'll go to Sammy.
Yeah, it says on your website about how you did the temple analogy, about how a temple is destroyed, and it seems like you are trying to sort of create a better society, but I wonder if it rests on premise starting with your acceptance of God.
Yes, it does.
So,
yes, it does. And in my case, it most emphatically does, because I'm a believer and a practicing Christian. However, my point is that you don't have to be a believer and a practicing Christian to realize that the society needs a moral and social adhesive, and that in its absence, things can go terribly wrong. Which is why, for example, such people as Roger Scruton, a friend of mine, he's quite a well-known, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's quite a well-known philosopher. He's an atheist himself, but he believes that we desperately need a religion and sees that as the only hope.
I can understand that common denominator, but when you talk about the specifics in terms of creating that adhesive, I wonder whether, because you're very critical of profits, people generating profits, but I wonder what would happen if...
I'm not critical at all about people generating profits. If I convey that impression, I'm sorry, because without profits we would not have any economy at all. What I'm...
Size or the scale?
What I'm... not just the size and the scale, but single-minded devotion to that with absolutely no moral, social, cultural breaks. What I'm saying is, if you look at modern financial services, be that your hedge funds, your banks, they all operate a pyramid scheme. I mean, they do not even ask themselves the question whether it's moral or not. They only ask themselves the question, is it legal or not? Can I get caught, or can I get away with it? No, I'm not at all against profits, God forbid. But what I'm saying is that profits by themselves, and in a hugely profitable economy, do not a healthy society make.
Can I just ask, as a follow-up, what sort of indicates to you that there is this lack of moral drive in the financial sector? Because I understand that it's not usually talked about these companies being moral, but...
Well, look at, as the Bible says, you shall know them by their fruit. And look at what they do. I mean, they look at banks for the sake of bankers, for the sake of this year's profit, going into suicidal loan activities, for example, knowing damn well. It doesn't take too many years of 7-figure bonuses to be set for life, and that's what they all go for. And they completely neglect their customers. They certainly neglect their shareholders.
Their starting philosophy is all about this life. So for these.
My point exactly that when starting philosophy it's all about this life. Mm-hmm. Then this life degenerates into what we see now in front of us. We see young people, and I certainly don't mean students at Warwick University, but people in city centres, going out on Saturday night for the sole purpose of achieving oblivion of some kind. There was an article in one of the papers on Sunday, actually, about Cardiff, complete with photographs of young girls sort of rolling in the gutter and passing out and relieving themselves publicly. I mean, that is something you would not have seen in England even 20 years ago. I mean, never mind 100 years ago.
I agree with you. I probably liken it to a massive dose of Christian morality. But I wonder who you think is the best place to kind of do that, because sometimes I think the church isn't.
That's a different matter altogether. Well, Christianity does not exist outside the church, basically. I mean, the church is as essential to Christianity as scriptural texts. If you say that today's church is not living up to that mission, then you would be absolutely right. Because the churches, or organized churches today, certainly the Church of England, the Catholic churches, certainly fall very, very far short.
But it's like how do you inject this kind of morality into the banks? Do you propose kind of like the bishop overseeing the banks?
No.
I wonder how it would work in practice.
No, the only way in which the church, if it were to function properly, can improve our politics and our banks is by improving our politicians and our bankers. I don't think the church should meddle in day-to-day activities of the practical kind. I don't think that's in the business. The church should operate within the realm that's infinitely higher than the one where politics and economics operate. The church should provide a moral standard and if you will, a teleological standard that people will use as a guide to their own lives, and then they would act differently. I mean, a banker in Florence in the 16th century would not have given somebody an unsecured loan to pay for a holiday, for example. And the reason would have been not just financial, but also because he felt it would have been morally wrong. Our bankers don't feel that. And our politicians are even worse, in my view, actually.
I have a question. This is more to do with the economics. I understand that you're talking of a moral standard as a way to guide decisions in economics. But what you talk about is very fundamental to economics, which is the creation of value. And you seem to be saying that the tangible value that we generate doesn't match the service-based value, but that grossly inflates it.
Well, let's look at one little measure, which is GDP. GDP essentially is the sum total of all goods and services that society delivers. Now, how is it measured? Let's say I go to a bank and I get a loan for £1,000 from the bank. The GDP of the United Kingdom goes up by that £1,000. The bank then grabs that £1,000, issues a derivative bond on it to the value of £1,500 and sells it on. That's another £1,500 added to the GDP without anything at all being created, other than paper being shuffled around. And of course, there's time and place for that. Some of that is absolutely essential. Vibrant financial markets are a must. But when a society does only that, I mean, that simply is not going to work. And every economist, you look at the classical American economists, people like Friedman or Gilder or whoever, they all will tell you that it's much better not to make anything, not to manufacture anything, because we produce a lot of value, and we in other ways, and we use that value to buy the goods abroad, where they can be made much more cheaply. Now they disregard, for example, the fact that the Chinese, who provide an awful lot of consumer goods in the West now, the people who actually make those goods starve, essentially. They live on a bowl of rice a day. That sort of concern doesn't bother them at all. But that, however, raises another question, which is a very practical one, not a moral one. What do we do with those millions of people who used to be engaged in manufacturing? I mean, what are they going to do? Are they going to become systems analysts? Are they going to become bankers? Are they going to become professors of sociology? No, they're going to go on welfare. So yes, I mean, it's much better to get, I mean, if you don't mind the personal, intimate detail, you know, I bought a packet of 3 underpants at Marks and Spencer for £3 the other day, made in China. And that's £1 a pair. Now, if you just think what's involved, I mean, somebody has to produce the cotton, somebody has to stitch it together, somebody has to run the factory where it's happening, somebody has to ship it, somebody has to pay all sorts of middlemen, somebody has to store it, somebody has to pay customs duties. By the time you're finished, you realize that the people who make those things don't make any money at all. You know, and the same sort of happens here. I mean, we have the official unemployment rate is approaching 10% in the United Kingdom, but that is a fallacy, because people who are on the sickie, on the health benefit, are not classed as unemployed. And if you look at the number of those in this country, then we have more cripples in the UK now than in the immediate aftermath of either World War. You know, clearly, I think most people who receive that particular benefit, if you held the gun to their head, not that I'm suggesting that measure, would find a way of supporting themselves. So, yes, I mean, I think an economy should be balanced. There should be a vibrant manufacturing sector, and there should be a vibrant service economy. But the country could not just survive. The City of London provides, if somebody can correct me, I'll be very, very grateful for that, but I think the City of London provides something in the neighborhood of a fourth of our income in this country. So a fourth of all our income comes from 1 square mile. I don't think that's healthy, personally. And we're seeing proof that it's not healthy. You know, if you look at this example I gave about this girl who, after 2 years in the business, and she was a very good-looking girl, and I'm very happy that she made it. But that hedge fund only hired good-looking girls to hustle business on the correct assumption that they would be more successful in appealing to investors than a chap like me with 2 bottles of Rioja on his breath. So that's all she did. And she was selling things that were completely, not only worthless, but ruinous. Because the hedge funds at that time were losing money right, left, and center. So within 2 years after out of university, she was making more than £500,000 a year. If somebody tells me that reflects her market worth in any other than the virtual world, I'd argue. You know, we're taught. I mean, by we I mean conservatives. We're taught to pray at the altar of free markets and free economies, and indeed markets should be free, and economies should be free, and the government should not dictate how people make money or what they do with their money. But a market in which the government taxes people at 60 or 70% is not a free market. For example, I mentioned this figure to you. In the Celtic fringe of this country, in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, the government's take of the economy is 75%. In Stalin's Russia, and nobody ever accused Stalin of being a champion of free enterprise, Stalin's Russia was about 85%. So So yes, Scotland is, or Wales is still much freer than Stalin's Russia, but you can see which way it's going, because a government that dominates the economic scene as it does now, eventually will start dominating everything else. Economic totalitarianism will eventually lead to other forms of totalitarianism, and we see that happening. Like what is the culture of political correctness if not fascism? People telling the government and the courts, telling people not only what they should not say, but also what they should not think. You know, it's a way, again, because we live in a society where people don't disappear in the middle of the night, and where they cannot be physically coerced to do things, but there are other levers. You know, if a government that lives by the bullet is mostly scared of the bullet, a government that lives by the word is mostly scared of the word, which is why controlling language and controlling the way people talk is of such critical importance to our governments. And of course, the economic lever is exactly that. They use that to increase their power. When people say that the welfare state doesn't work, the welfare doesn't work for us, but it works extremely well for the governments, because the welfare state makes them omnipotent for all intents and purposes. You see. And of course, the demagoguery that one hears on that subject, because I do argue, both publicly and privately, against that. People say, well, before the NHS, people were dying in the streets. No, they were. I mean, in the 1930s, which was not the most prosperous decade in the history of this country, or the West in general, there were more hospitals built in England than there have been built ever since the national health was introduced. And that was more than 60 years ago. People need to have food, they need to have medical care, they need to have places to live and all that. But we have been sold the lie that it takes a strong, omnipotent state to provide those things, at least partly. It doesn't. People can manage much better without it. And surely, I mean, it must be seen to anybody with a modicum of moral sense that to take 60 or 70% of what somebody makes in the sweat of his brow and give it to somebody who has never worked, who doesn't want to work, and the same goes for his parents and for their parents, because we now have three generations of welfare recipients. If somebody tells me that there's nothing morally wrong with that, I will argue to the bitter end.
So we've seen that Mr. Booth is more than willing to defend his position, and that it's not a very mainstream position. So we'd like to encourage you, as the Warwick Libertarian Society, to take the liberty to ask the most riveting questions and even challenge his views, if necessary, instead of going away with the feeling that perhaps it's not a very secular talk or something, but because there's a lot of logical arguments gone into the construction of his position, which I'm sure he'd be more than glad to defend. So if anybody has any questions that even are opposed to his views as general, please do challenge him.
Well, recently back in America there was the Republican debate, and you probably heard about how the audience actually cheered when the question was asked about a young man, hypothetically, that he didn't buy health insurance, then he went into a coma, and then the moderator asked the candidates, well, what should we as a society do? Should we just let him die? And a few of the audience members cheered. And I find that as like a very disturbing other extreme.
I agree with you.
I'm not sure what the balance in the middle is.
Well, I I absolutely agree with you. In the civilized society, people don't die without medical help. I mean, let's take that as the starting point, and there's absolutely no question that should be like that. The next question is how we achieve that desirable result, and I think the way it used to be done in the States, was not perfect. On this earth, we're not blessed with perfect institutions, but it was done pretty well, where people who were in work typically had health insurance as part of their package, whatever. Those who didn't work but had some money could buy insurance, and those who neither worked nor had any money would go into the municipal hospitals, where they were treated by the same doctors, but where the facilities were not as luxurious as in private hospitals. For example, there would be more people to reward. Of course, what undermined that system of the states was litigiousness. And specifically things like contingency fees that lawyers were charging to chase ambulances, and so eventually the cost of private insurance became prohibitive. So instead of responding in a rational way, which is addressing the cause of the problem and limiting the litigiousness of the whole system, the government of the current president finally decided to take something that Teddy Kennedy has been pushing since the 1960s, which is, for all intents and purposes, a version of our own dear NHS, which essentially makes us possibly the only first world country with a third world medical care. Not to mention the fact that it's ruinous. You know that the NHS is the largest employer in Europe. Not just in this country, but in Europe. I mean, again, there has to be balance. And if you look at the NHS, how it works and how it will work in the States before too long, if the whole thing goes through, even 20 or 30 years ago, a hospital was run by two people. We had a doctor and the matron. They were both medical people, and they ran the hospital. Now, the administrative staff very often outnumbers the actual frontline medical staff. For example, a friend of mine worked until recently at the hospital in Birmingham, and they had to cut down the number of their hospital beds for lack of funds. At the same time as they were cutting down the number of beds, which is, after all, the raison d'etre of a hospital, they hired, at the cost of $100,000 a year, a chap whose job title was Director of Diversity. And the first thing he did was issue a totally illiterate memorandum saying how important it is to appreciate religious differences. For example, he said Islam is the principal religion of the Republic of Congo. It's not. It's a very, very, very distant third, for example. And that chap, to hire him, they had to, I don't know how many hospital beds, 100,000 a year corresponds to, plus benefits and plus everything else, but quite a few, you see. So yes, if somebody asked me that question, should somebody who doesn't have medical insurance should die like a stray dog in the street, I would say no. You know, he should be taken care of. Not necessarily by the government. There should be charities that do that sort of thing. And it's extremely easy to make charities much more widespread. For example, if you make charitable contributions not just tax deductible but tax free, for instance, that would boost the funds of charities, and they could then, private charities could then take on a lot of functions that are currently performed by the government. But if the question is put like that, which is called reductio ad absurdum in Latin, you know, reducing it to the absolute extreme, the absurd extreme, I would say no, you should be taken care of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Does anybody have a question?
Oh yeah. Well, you mentioned part of the problem was being emphasis on material gain.
Exclusive emphasis.
Yeah, but recently there's been, or what I'd say, more emphasis on moral implications, well, particularly from individual investors themselves, where people don't want to invest in immoral companies, such as what's happened with Nike. So social and environmental factors are becoming more important in some respects.
In very few and very minor respects. People who invest their money want to invest it securely and profitably. People who are really concerned with things like environmental or other issues are not so much secondary as tertiary, I'd say. But yes, the language is used quite a lot.
And the government has put a few more policies to do with equality considerations, such as equal pay for women, making sure... Well,
to say that I am against that sort of thing is to say, like, it would be like saying that I'm against cannibalism. You know? I think it's criminal. I don't think it's up to the government to tell private businesses how they should run themselves, provided that they're not hurting the public. If you know what I mean. The people, I used to run a business myself. And I used to run into that's a sort of problem. I think the sole consideration for employment should be the person's qualification for the job, not the person's race, religion, or anything else, or sex. So when the government takes measures to enforce either equality or environmental things or things like that, the government is doing exactly what I've been talking about. Increasing its own power, which is the sole desideratum. I mean, if you think that people like our politicians actually do genuinely care about more women being on boards of directors, I assure you that that's not the case. What they want to do is they want to pull the strings. They want to put their foot down and say, we shall tell you how to run your life and your business.
I don't know. I think it is important to some respect as well, because you know, in some countries like the Philippines, you often get a situation where in all the major retail markets, it's only 18 to 25-year-old women on each and every stall and running every place, and then people over 40 can't find work and then get sent to the street.
Well, that may explain how well the Philippines is doing in the global market. What I'm saying is no free economy can afford to do what you're saying with impunity. No free economy can exist if people over 40 cannot find a job. In this country, people over 40 make up something like 60 or 70% of the workforce. For example, if they were unable to find work, this country would grind to a standstill. I don't know about the Philippines, but in general, whenever I'm talking about those things, I'm talking strictly about the West. Because striking out and going into other civilizations, you have to consider their religion, their cultural history, their social history, and that opens too many cans of worms, in my view, which is why I'm talking specifically about Christianity, because the West was what we call the West, not geographically but culturally, was built around Christianity. You could take that away, but then you have to replace it with something else, which we haven't done. The Philippines, for example, was not built around Christianity, even though it's largely Christian now. But so I don't think it's up to the government to be an active player in the game of economics. The government's role is to be a referee, but not to tell people what to do. For example, I'm entirely in sympathy with the government putting its foot down when it comes to anti-monopoly legislation, because I think that's good. Because when companies get together and do price fixing, when they no longer compete, they undermine the premise of the free market. They destroy competition, and they basically hurt the consumer. You see, so if the government says, well, you cannot do that, I'd be in sympathy with that. But when the government says at least 35% of your board of directors have to be women, and 20% Muslim, and 30% cripples, and 20% lesbians, I mean, we're running into problems there, I think.
It's really the individuals on that themselves, the individuals are all about monetary gain. I'm saying that intrinsically, the public nowadays have more of a kind of emphasis on equality. They want, it's the people who want equality.
I disagree with that observation. I mean, equality is a shibboleth, is sort of a code word.
Fairness, really.
Hmm?
Well, fairness, really.
Well, it is equality essentially. There's only one equality which actually is praiseworthy, and that's equality before God. Everything else, any other type of equality, and before the law as well, any other type of equality goes against human nature. Because we, contrary to what the American Declaration of Independence says, we're not created equal. Some people are tall, some people are short, some are good looking, some are like me, some people are brilliant, some people are not, some people are good at mathematics, some people are good at football, and so on and so forth. And if people are not made equal, then the only way to make them equal is to reduce them to the lowest common denominator. In fact, in my book, I make an argument that there's only one place where people are truly equal in the world, and that's in prison. Because there's perfect equality of all inmates, and only the warder stands above them as the only unequal man. Everybody else is equal. And in general, the amount of liberty in the society and the amount of equality are definitely inversely proportional. The more of one, the less of the other. So you have to decide whether you want equality or whether you want freedom. And that is a choice.
Okay, Martin, I'm going to stop you there because we need to give other people a chance, but only temporarily. You can go on afterwards. Does anybody have another pressing question? Okay, I'm going to ask a question because a lot of people are hugely skeptical when the word religion is used, especially when say, Christianity, even based on a functional society, is mentioned. So if you were to secularize your argument to point out as to why Christianity makes markets work and our civilization in general, what would you say its this moral adhesive role
I would
is?
use the historical argument. The West, as distinct from the East, for example, was built around Christianity. I mean, everything spins out of it. I mean, if you look at, for example, one of you, I understand, is studying law. I mean, if you look at Western law, for example, I mean, going back step by step, you can trace it to biblical injunctions. I mean, a society has to have a metaphysical core to it. What happens when it loses it was demonstrated by the Roman Empire, for example. When the Roman Empire lost its metaphysical core. It went bust and it disappeared. And that's happened to lots of society. You know, this has to be a metaphysical core that unites atomized individuals into society. And in the West, in my view, that can only be Christianity. Whether you are a fervent believer yourself or not is practically irrelevant.
So could you give us a concrete example of how these links are made?
Well, I mean, I dare say that, well, for example, running our financial institutions the way they are run. I mean, could you seriously see a devout Christian doing what our pyramid scheme operators are doing in financial markets? Yes, they would, because people are always imperfect, and Christianity doesn't make people perfect. But if you look statistically, if you look at big numbers, I dare say the difference will be very noticeable. You know, it's as I say, we are to a very large extent. We build our lives around what we believe, and that's always been the case. And in the West, for example, even 100 years ago, to think that the society would be openly secular, it was already secular underneath it all, but to think that society could openly proclaim its secularism would have been unthinkable. And we're talking only about 100 years ago. You know, and we see all around us the consequences of a society that's guided only, where each person is guided by what that person considers right. And that cannot be. A society cannot survive like that. You know, if I may regard, for example, wife beating as wrong, somebody else may regard it as right. I mean, where do we derive the moral authority to judge one way or the other?
Do you think rather than it being an idea of absolute right and wrong, in the sense that people believe they're right, rather than they have a doubt about proclaimed absolutisms of people who are in charge? So I think the problem with your idea of making Christianity the only sort of moral standard is that it's because people can't believe it's true. It's that sort of constraint upon individual choice that itself needs to.
Well, if they massively don't believe it's true, then you're right. But if people are raised in that spirit, I think you will find that many will believe it's true. And if you look at Christianity, the only places, by the way, where Christianity is not doing well is in Western Europe and the United States. Christianity is doing extremely well in Africa, for example. Christianity is doing extremely well in Latin America. The numbers are swelling. You see, and even in China, there's a growing number of Christians. Where it's going down the drain is here. You know, and in parallel with that, we see that our economies are going down the drain as well. I see a causal relationship there. I really do. Although I can see where not everybody would. It's just that I know for most of, I dare say most of my friends are atheists or agnostics. If somebody could explain to me what the difference is, I'd be very grateful. But some aren't. And by and large, I see a difference in behavioral modes. You know, I could see that the limits of what is and what isn't allowable are kind of different. You see, as would stand to reason, if you think that everything you do is known and will be judged by an authority that's infinitely higher than you are, and that will determine how you will spend the rest of the eternity, you're more likely to act in a reasonable fashion than not, don't you think?
It still eludes the actual question of what is right and wrong, and if you don't...
Well, what is right and what is wrong at base can only be absolute. The moment it becomes relative, the concept disappears.
The word absolute is quite ambiguous because to talk of it...
The most unambiguous word I know.
It's impossible to define. I mean, if you're trying to talk about an actual idea of right and wrong, which is sort of separate from society, so it can be, I mean, that doesn't exist in a purely metaphysical, but it's worked out constantly through the actions of people in society.
Well,
so
yes, in details, but in principle, it was constant for about 1,500 years, and unquestioned for about 1,500 years of the existence of Western civilization. It's only in the last few centuries when questions began to appear.
have been lots of...
Sorry?
It's not so because it's not been questioned.
En masse, I'm talking about.
Is it 1,500 years?
Well, I would say roughly from the time of the Renaissance, so a bit more than 1,500 years. Roughly from the appearance of Renaissance humanism.
What about like Nietzsche and...
Well, Nietzsche's 19th century.
Say 1,500 years, sorry.
Yeah, for the first 1,500 years, I said.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, well, people, how shall I put it? There have always been either religious laws or secular laws that have been questioned. But what forms a society and what makes, for example, like the American Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So what forms a nation, and certainly what forms a society, is a situation where the greatest majority of all people hold the same truths to be self-evident. You see, because that determines how society is generated and how it survives.
Except that it never does get generated at the end of a discussion. It always gets declared as self-evident and then set as the constitution.
Well, it would not. Well, that's not true, actually. For example, this country doesn't have a written constitution. This country has a constitution.
Talking about America, I mean, if we stay in America,
well, America is unique in that it was a very young country. But I've always thought, incidentally, Americans, and I don't mean to say all Americans to be in any way disparaging. In fact, I hold an American passport as well as my own. So, Americans in general believe what they're told to believe, and the founding documents of the American Republic, which is the Declaration of the Constitution, are held as a scripture, almost. But if you look, especially at the Declaration, it's a kind of an odd document, and Americans always say that we don't have any constitution because we don't have a written document which is called the Constitution of the United Kingdom. I think that a written constitution is a bit like a prenuptial agreement stipulating the frequency of sex. I mean, if you have to put it down, you might as well not bother. And De Master, who was perhaps the greatest constitutional scholar, or one of the greatest constitutional scholars I know, De Master wrote that unless a constitution is written in people's hearts, writing it on paper will not do it. And so a real constitution evolved over centuries. and it evolves very gradually, and and it's always based on public.
So on that point, would you recommend that Christianity were to be sort of imposed, or would it be democratically, this moral standard, would it have to be democratically discussed?
I don't know what you mean by impose.
I mean,
I don't think that people should be, like for example, when Russia was baptized 1,000 years ago, it was baptized by Prince Vladimir of Kiev, who decided to become a Christian, and he issued a declaration that on such and such date, every citizen of Kiev shall appear at the banks of the Dnieper, in whose waters they will be baptized, and those who don't do that will be impaled. You see, that is not right, obviously. So no, I don't think it should be imposed by force. However, I think it should be given a much greater prominence in education, for instance. I think...
isn't the education system already working as a sort of imposition? I mean, it doesn't...
Oh, if you mean that sort of imposition, then I don't mind that. It's like saying that parents impose their values on their children. Well, that's their function. That's what they're there for. Yes. Values. When you're talking about children, values need to be imposed. Children will not develop their values of their own accord. When given the choice of doing anything they want, children will do what they love doing, which is nothing. Yes, I do think that education must be coercive, but not in the sense of the state imposing its standards. I think this is up to the family, and yes, it's up to the school. So that type of imposition, I don't mind.
Mr. Booth, what would you say about multiculturalism? For instance, I'm of almost the same persuasion as you, but like when you talk about a particular religion being the moral standard, what gives it the moral legitimacy, one? Two, how would it handle diversity? Because our societies are fairly like interspersed with a multiplicity of identities. Yeah.
Well, in this country, of course, we have a state religion, we have an established religion. The realm of the United Kingdom is based on the Anglican Church. If you read, for example, the documents of the coronation of our present Queen, there is religious language in every sentence. So that will give it legitimacy. This country is historically and legally is built around the Christian premise. As to the multicultural thing, diversity is good as long as it doesn't presuppose the elimination of the core culture. And the way democracy had multiculturalism and diversity had been used in this country has led exactly to that. That suddenly all cultures are on the table and they're all equal. A society cannot live like that. One religion and one set of values have to be dominant, which doesn't mean that all others should be suppressed or oppressed. The people should be free to worship any way they want. But there should be absolutely no doubt, in my view, that just as the Constitution of this country specifically says in those constitutional documents that appear in an isolated way, there's absolutely no question that this country has to proclaim that Christianity is the dominant culture. As I say, but that doesn't mean that we should convert people by force, for example, which is the way Islam was mostly spread around the world. Or that we should say to people, you cannot worship whatever you want. But a society can impose certain standards based on our values. For example, if somebody says, I want to celebrate New Year's Eve, not on the 31st of December, some other day, fine. If I want to fast, not during Lent, but at some other time, fine. If I don't want to fast at all, fine. Somebody says I shall force my daughter to marry whomever I want, and if she doesn't agree, I'll kill her. That's not fine. So multiculturalism is not a suicide pact, and we should always remember that multiculturalism is not only couscous, but also the stoning of adulterers. You can't have one without the other. But a civilized society cannot be monocultural. It cannot be monochrome. It cannot be. Can you imagine how boring London would be if everybody, but absolutely everybody, looked like David Cameron? So you see, again, we're talking about diversity. Either we're talking about real diversity or virtual diversity. Either we're talking about decent respect for other people's beliefs, or we're talking about equalizing all beliefs and saying they're all equal, they're all on the table, and children can pull them out of the hat. And for me, those are very different things. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah. In a way, you've said that multiculturalism is good, but we shouldn't...
Not the way the word is used these days.
No, we shouldn't err to this line that we shouldn't be compromising if the harm principle is basically destroyed by certain values like killing, honor killing, and that kind of thing. So
not just that. I think, for example, in the 1960s, there was something like 60 mosques in England. Now there are something like 3,000. I mean, there's whole areas, whole towns that are practically run by the Sharia law. I think that's wrong. I think it should be the same law for the whole country. So I would not sacrifice what this country actually stands for the sake of diversity.
So, but do you believe if, like, the Muslim population makes up a major part of Britain, they should have a say in what gets legislated?
Absolutely, just like everybody else.
So you don't believe in ghettoized communities, but you believe in a common law that is based on the dominant culture of the land, even if the culture changes?
Of course, they're more than welcome to go to voting booths and vote out or in whoever they want.
Okay.
But they cannot do what they're doing now by putting stickers saying this area is ruled by Sharia law. That I don't think they have the right to do.
Anybody have a question? Stuart.
Isn't there a risk sort of reclaiming, say, Christianity, but it wouldn't have to be Christianity, I suppose, as a sort of single, unifying religion, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, that it could become just another means of controlling people. You noted earlier that it barely makes sense to talk about Christianity without reference to the church. So isn't there a risk that if morality is so closely based on essentially the church, that you could potentially end up with...
That can only be asked historically. If you look, for example, just for the sake of argument, at the reign of probably the most absolute monarch in the West of the last 500 years, Louis XIV of France, for example. And the country was very Christian then. Now it's completely secular. But at that time it was really Christian, and religion really mattered. Well, I dare say, using the religion or any other instruments of coercion, Louis XIV had a hell of a lot less power over a peasant somewhere in Auvergne or Gascogne than any democratically elected Western prime minister or president has over us all. I mean, he was practically powerless. I mean, he could rule the lives of his courtiers. He could tell dukes and counts, go there, don't go there. He could kill them but he was practically powerless against the lower reaches of the population. For example, whenever a medieval, which is to say Christian, country went to war, princes had to go begging for soldiers, because they would have to beg their vassals for soldiers. Now a modern politician can conscript the whole population and imprison those who don't want to go at the drop of a hat. So no, I don't think so. I think if you're saying, what about theocracy, where the church actually rules secular matters, then I'm very, very much opposed to that. The church does not have that kind of power. But history doesn't show that societies in which the church is extremely strong are less free than those that aren't, really. I mean, just think how much power our state has over us, even as we speak. They can take Toya, for example, quoted 70%. She said the government takes 70%. I think the figure is in taxes. I think the figure is a bit high, but certainly way over half of what we make. I mean, do you think Louis XIV could have done that? Do you think George III could have done that? Under absolutely no circumstances. The church demanded tithes, for example, but the tithes were never over 10%. I mean, it wouldn't have occurred to a pope, to a Roman pope, to demand that the tithes should be 70%, or as was the case in this country in the 60s, 95%. We had 95% marginal rates. So the risk, whenever people are involved, there are always risks. People are imperfect. People will do horrible things, and people have killed in the name of God just as avidly and as efficiently as in the name of any secular cause. We are not given perfection on this earth. But I think on balance, if you talk comparatively, I would say that the Christian society would be a lot freer than a secular society. I really do think that. And history proves that.
Well, it's just that you could also argue that throughout history, governments or whatever haven't had all of the advantages that any organisation has today.
Such as?
Instant communications. It's now possible to manage what's going on in a foreign Paris, for example.
Well, it was certainly more difficult, yes. But it's like saying, how shall I put it? For example, if you look at people who died violent deaths, there were more people dying violent deaths in the 20th century than in all the other centuries of known history combined. Now people say that's because of the tools we're using are so much more sophisticated. We have machine guns, we have dive bombers, we have God knows what else, and that's why we can kill a lot more people. Well, I'm saying that probably at least half of all those people murdered in the 20th century were killed by technical means that have long been within the domain of the possible in the world. For example, in Russia, the Bolsheviks murdered, by various estimates, was somewhere around 60 million people in about as many years, 60 years. And what they used, the tools they used, were a bullet in the nape of the neck, torture, inhuman incarceration, and artificial famines. I mean, people could have done it 1,000 years ago. Well, minus the bullet, but a reasonable equivalent thereof. The same goes for this. I don't think that the availability of the technical means of control is really the issue. I think it's the desire to do so and the urge to do so that's important. You see, I don't think, for example, that Louis XIV had the internet at his disposal, I don't think he would have wanted to control the peasants in Normandy the same way as our government controls us. I really don't think so, but you know, as they say, history doesn't like the subjunctive mood.
Well, I mean, it's just because you're arguing, what was I going to say now? You're arguing before that people in power are motivated, perhaps more than anything else, by a desire to protect their position.
Today?
Yes.
Hasn't always been the case.
Well,
it hasn't.
Isn't that what motivated Louis XIV?
No, not at all. Louis XIV was born to a royal family, and he was a very firm believer in the divine right of kings. He was discharging what he saw as a responsibility. And the same goes for well, look at this country. Look at the statesmen that this country had, even in the sort of late 18th and throughout the 19th century, and compare them to the Tony, Johnny, Davies of today. Look at people like, you know, your Pitt, your Canning, your Burke, your Disraeli, Gladstone. I mean, they were not people driven exclusively by personal ambition, exclusively by lust for power. They saw, yes, they needed the power to do what they had to do, but they had to do something other than gaining and keeping power. I don't see such statesmen around these days, do you?
Well, maybe we won't know for another 100 years or so.
But I don't see where they will appear from. You see, I know quite a few MPs, and I don't know if you've met any, but when you talk to them privately, well, at any rate, I'm appalled because they don't possess, in my view, the most elementary humanity. They act the way automata act. They're sort of like a lion was brought into this world to chase the antelope, and the antelope was brought into this world to run away from the lion. So they can do only one thing, and that's all they can do. I remember there was a book of mine, one of those less successful ones that Toem didn't mention. It was sort of a collaboration, and there were quite a few MPs among the authors. And the launch party was at the Commons. And the chap who was the editor of that was a Conservative MP, and he was a member of Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. So he's one of the good guys, ostensibly. But when we got there, it was sort of 6 o'clock or so, he was knackered. He obviously had a very long day, possibly a long night before that, and he was sitting in his chair with his tie undone, no expression in his eyes. The man was just at the end of his tether. And suddenly, when the time came to deliver a speech, everything changed. Suddenly, his eyes began to shine. Color appeared in his face. He jumped up and started delivering the usual platitudes that they all talk about. They just, another example, you know Bill Cash. Bill Cash was the leader of the anti-Maastricht faction within the MP. And he and his friends were called bastards by John Major when that thing was going through. And at some point, when the bill was about to be signed, he and some of his colleagues sequestered themselves at the hotel, and without them, the government didn't have a majority. That's when John Major called them bastards. Anyway, I happened to run into Bill Cash at the time, and I said, "You can solve the problem just like that. Resign, all of you. If you resign, the government doesn't have the votes to carry it through." And he looked at me as if I suggested that we should all kill our young and eat them. You know, it was completely unthinkable to him that he would sacrifice his own career for what he considered to be public good. We just don't have people like that anymore. We just don't. And that is a result in my view, this is the result of democracy run riot.
Does anybody else have any questions? No.
Yeah, it still doesn't clear to me how you define Christianity. How do you define Christianity? What are these core values from which you said, which you mentioned? In my book, there are several versions of Christianity, which aren't the same. Often they are contradictory. So there are Protestants, there are Catholics, there are Orthodox people, and
there are several.
And the things that Jesus said are a bit different from that. What is proposed by the Pope, maybe, I don't know, but
the differences among Christian confessions are very lamentable, and I'm sorry that they exist. But if you ask how you define a Christian, then the answer is a Christian is somebody who believes in the divinity of Christ. And in that area, all Christian denominations agree. Everything else is historical and all sorts of things. There are all sorts of historical reasons for diversities. But for example, if High Anglicans talk about transubstantiation, or consubstantiation, and Catholics talk about transubstantiation, yeah, that's a difference. But it's minute comparing to what unites them, which is the faith in Christ. And as to this country, this country has an established religion. The Church of England is the state religion. So essentially, and that different questions, because you say how to define Christianity, that's very easy. If you say why we have different confessions, that's more difficult, and takes a bit of time. But but in this country, that issue was settled in the reign of Elizabeth I. And countries, most countries are predominantly one or the other. There are quite a few Catholics in Germany, for example, but Germany is predominantly a Protestant country. There are quite a few Catholics here, but most people, when they do a census, they write COE, even though they don't believe it as the first word. But so does that begin to answer the question at all?
Yeah, maybe, but what are these Christian values? For you, these genuinely Christian values, which separate Christianity from every other religion, ideology, or something else? Absolutely.
Christianity, the whole concept of the West, of the Christian West, spins out of the personality of the person of Jesus Christ, both God and both man. So Christianity offers this unique fusion of the physical and the transient, and the metaphysical and the eternal. No other religion does that. Yes, Christianity is absolutely unique. But I was trying to avoid theological discussions. You see, my book, which you're most cordially invited to buy, by the way, I have a few copies here. My book is not about theology so much as it is about how that can work in practical life, specifically economics. You see, you see, a mistake people often make about Christianity, if you want to talk about it, it's slightly off the subject here. They look at the moral dicta of Christianity and they say they're not all that different from Judaism, for example. And in fact, the Ten Commandments, which is the Old Testament, are part of the Christian canon. Or you could go so far as to say that they're not that different from any other religion. And that's true, because I mean, you won't find too many religions in the world that say it's okay to kill or to lie under oath or to disrespect your parents or to steal. You won't find religions that do that, but that's not what Christianity is about. The morality of Christianity is derivative. It derives from Christ. And that's where it's dramatically different from any other religion. You see, it's not just about how shall I put it? Christianity is not just a teaching by Christ; it's a teaching about Christ. That's what it's about. It's not just the Sermon on the Mount where he laid down the moral precepts of the New Testament. And it's neither is it just Moses getting the stone tablets with the commandments on the mount. Christianity goes much further than that, you see, and that's how the practical life of the Western world has always been organized. This fusion of the metaphysical and the physical, of the transient and the eternal, and that is unique. For example, if you look at the morality of Buddhism, it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. But how many great Buddhist scientists do you see? It's because if you're like me, you probably won't be able to name a single one. And the reason for that is that the Buddhists essentially despise the physical world. And they do not believe that the physical world could be anything other than evil, which is why the essence of Buddhism is salvation from the world, whereas the essence of Christianity is salvation of the world. And because Christianity always had this vital physical aspect to it, that science became essentially a Christian pursuit. I mean, how many great Japanese scientists can you name? I can't name a single one. You probably could one or two. How many great Taoist scientists can you name? Difficult. If I ask you how many great Christian scientists you can name, you could probably keep me here until the next morning.
I'd have to disagree with you, but it's a qualified disagreement. A lot of Tibetan Buddhists, for instance, have written the canon of epistemology, the nature of knowledge itself, because of their extremely nuanced critique or understanding of the nature of consciousness.
I know that, but I was talking specifically about science. I wasn't talking about epistemology or philosophy.
Healthcare, eudaimonic healthcare, draws a lot from Buddhism, and it works extremely hard.
Eudaimonic healthcare does draw a lot from Buddhism, but when those chaps get cancer, they get chemotherapy. They don't rely entirely on eudaimonic welfare. They really don't.
Does anybody have a question?
Yeah, I don't want a theological debate too, but there's some point I want to make. You emphasize this connection between the physical and the metaphysical in Christianity. So, in my understanding, that would be kind of a Protestantic view. So, and you say that 1500 years Christianity worked here, but Protestantic Christian views are relatively new, so far as I know.
Well, so I essentially am rather anti-Reformation myself. If you read this book, I have a chapter on that. I do regard the Reformation as a generally detrimental factor in the history of the West. But I don't think that this fusion of the physical and metaphysical is Protestant. It's just general Christian. It comes out of the person of Jesus Christ, who was both physical and metaphysical. That is, it's not strictly Protestant at all. I mean, on the contrary, I dare say that in Catholic countries, the physical aspect is accentuated perhaps too much. You know, if you compare, let's say, Catholicism with Orthodoxy, Orthodoxy is mostly mystical, and a great deal of it is sort of borderline anti-clerical, whereas Catholicism, as you know, cannot possibly be anti-clerical. So the fusion of the physical and metaphysical, I think, is, in religious terms, is strictly Christian, and it's not sensitive to any kind of confessional divergences, I think.
Does anybody have another question? Okay, so if I may, I'd like to ask you one last question before we can continue this at the top.
Nothing personal, I hope.
Oh, nothing personal. Oh, yes. Okay, so this summer I went to Bhutan and I was studying about gross national happiness, which is essentially a sort of subjective lens for making policies so that governments aren't short-termist and taking into account core important values like the environment, like culture, like many of the concerns you have brought up. Do you think that morality as a mandated state, when both a vision and also quantified into certain core areas as like a guiding policy for government and a structure of state, can help lessen these crises of our time?
Yes.
And
in a word, yes. Well, crises, well, if you listen to our great minds, both in politics and economics, they talk about this financial crisis as a natural disaster. They say that, you know, and then the crisis hit. Crises don't just happen. People create crises. And people create crises by acting inappropriately. And they act inappropriately either because they don't know what is not appropriate or they don't care. You know, so yes, I would say a solid moral core to society would probably reduce the number and the severity of crisis. I also suspect, and again, this is pure conjecture, that it would probably reduce the wealth of our societies, because it would probably prevent the single-minded pursuit of monetary happiness that we have been told to pursue. But the eudaimonic aspect of it is very interesting. There was a poll recently, last week, I think, where various European countries were analyzed and polled on the basis of how happy the citizens are and how they rate the quality of life in the country. And Britain came right at the bottom of the list, or very close to the bottom of the list, whereas countries like Poland, for example, they're a lot poorer than England in purely financial terms, scored much higher on the eudaimonic scale. But which is precisely what I'm saying, that the life cannot just be about money, but the way, the way our economy has been structured and the way our economy has evolved, people have to devote practically every waking moment to making money. I look at one example. I look at my wife's father, for example. My wife's father was he had been very late, so he was a curator at the Provincial Museum. He retired in the 60s. At the time, his salary was £2,000 a year in the mid-60s, which, if you factor in the inflation today, would be an equivalent of $36,000 a year, which is exactly the salary that the present curator of the same museum gets. Now, on that salary, he had 3 children in private schools and in public schools. They lived in the house which he bought for £2,000, which was his annual salary. The same house last year was sold for $300,000, which is almost 10 times more than the present curator gets. So what I'm saying is, when society moves along the route of what I call totalitarian economism. It draws people in and starts running people's lives as absolutely as communist societies do using other means. You just can't get out. It was still possible, for example, if you read, let's say, George Orwell, who was an impoverished writer in the 30s. He wrote a brilliant novel called Keep the Aspidistra Flying. I don't know if anybody has read it, but it's about a starving writer, which I'm rapidly becoming, so it's a subject that's very close to my heart. But yes, he was not wealthy, but he survived. Doing what he did then, today, he would die. Just as simple as that. He would not be able to do what he did then, living in the garret and banging out what his character did then, banging out poems. He was a poet. It's absolutely impossible. Yeah, you can write poetry on weekends and the after hours, but during the day you have to pursue money in a very aggressive fashion and wholehearted fashion, because a half-hearted attitude to that will not get you anything. You remember when I was still involved in business life, I always told people I'm more than ready to give half the money I'm making and to work half the hours I'm making. But that offer was never on the table. It's all or it's nothing. That is the normal choice, and you will probably, before too long, will find this out when you enter the rough and tumble of the job market. I mean, it's and that's and that, in my view, is a direct result of a very conscious policy on the part of Western governments over the last 100 years or so. That they do it not because they're stupid, not because they don't understand elementary economics, but because that's exactly the result they wish to achieve. In my view, I wouldn't defend it too strongly because it's conjectural, but nonetheless.